Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace. Did the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s fail? According to Black Lives Matter critical race theory in the 1619 Project, nothing seems to have changed. Is this true? We will talk with the president of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality's Niger Innis. He is the son of civil rights leader Roy Innis. We will discuss civil rights past and present when we return. Welcome to Kingdoms in Conflict. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wallace, and we're privileged to have with us today Mr. Niger Innis. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing very, very well, Eric. Always good to see you, my friend.
Well, thank you for being with us. I want to ask you a question about, I don't know how many people are watching right now actually know that much about the history of CORE. So could you tell us what the mission was and what you guys are doing today?
Absolutely. The Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, C-O-R-E, was established in 1942 as an outgrowth of a group of pacifists, Gandhian disciples, those following the leadership and the tactics of Mahatma Gandhi of India, who, as we know, famously liberated the people of India from under the colonial yoke of the British, but did it in a very aggressive way, did it in a very confrontational way, but did it in a very disciplined, non-violent way. And this group, which started the Fellowship for Reconciliation, was a group of young blacks and whites that came together to fight against injustice. Ironically, it was established in 1942. The Fellowship for Reconciliation is a little older than that, but CORE was officially established in 1942. And ironically, our first venture, which we did not succeed at, and I'd have to say it was good that we didn't succeed at it, is because we protested U.S. engagement in World War II, believe it or not. That was our first venture. Again, because we're passive, we're nonviolent. Mm-hmm. That was our first engagement. Well, I'm happy to say that I'm glad we failed at that mission, because I think it was a noble fight, and it was an important fight that the United States get engaged in to defeat Hitler's Germany, to defeat Mussolini's Italy, and Tojo's Japan. Mm-hmm. Well, soon after that, the leadership of CORE got together and said, well, you know what? Maybe we ought to focus on problems happening domestically in the United States, right, as opposed to getting engaged in international endeavors. So we dealt with a question that had been dogging the American people, and particularly Black Americans, since the end of Reconstruction, around 1876, depending on the historian. Some say it ended with the pulling out of troops from the Reconstruction era South. Some people in 1876, that's what took place. Mm-hmm. The horrific Tilden-Hayes compromise, where the Democrats essentially won the popular vote, but Republicans, in a very creative way, won the Electoral College, and they cut a deal. The Democrats said, look, we'll hold our nose and let your president become president of the United States, but you gotta pull out troops from the Reconstruction South. And those troops have basically, since the end of the Civil War, and since the passage of what I call the Black amendments, or the Black Bill of Rights, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment of the Constitution, mm-hmm, since that crescendo in the late 1860s, early 1870s, troops were in the South essentially protecting Black Republicans and their right to vote. You know, Eric, as well as I do, that at that time, we were overwhelmingly Black Republicans. And we obviously voted heavily for the Republican Party. The Republican Party depended on our vote back then. But the incident in 1876 was so horrific an election and the tensions that have been built up across the country regarding race relations were so dramatic that essentially the white Republican Party or white-led Republican Party turned its back on fellow Republicans that happen to be African American, and the troops were withdrawn from the South, and essentially that led to slowly but surely a creeping of Jim Crow,
Right.
a creeping of real voter suppression, not the nonsense that the progressives talk about and allege is voter suppression today, which is nonsense and bunk, and we can get into that a little later. I mean, what we're talking about in terms of voter suppression back then is not reducing the number of early voting days. It's not reducing the number of hours. It's not expanding the number of block boxes. You know, it is a gun, it is a shotgun, or it is a noose used to intimidate Black folk from exercising their hard-won, fought right to vote. And that, of course, that era, and again, historians differ. Some say it started in 1876. Some say it started in the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which was some 20 years later in 1896. But whatever the case is, it essentially, for more or less than half a century, was a regime against Black voting rights that essentially made us second-class citizens and trying the concept of separate and unequal. They call it separate and equal, Brother Eric, but you and I know it was separate and very unequal. Blacks were second-class and in many cases third-class citizens in their own country. And so CORE, fast forwarding to 1942 and to the 1950s, CORE was engaged in protesting and pushing back against this evil system of segregation. And we had the wind to our backs in the famous Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954, which essentially overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896.
Niger, before you explain Plessy versus Ferguson.
Yes, absolutely. Plessy versus Ferguson, again, keep in mind, this is an era when Black voting and Black citizenship rights are going in reverse after the great strides and gains we had made after the Civil War, and due to the hundreds of thousands of white Americans and Black Americans that gave their lives for, and a white president named Abraham Lincoln, all gave their lives for Black freedom. We had started to truly become a multiracial democracy.
Right.
That was a real grasp and a real brilliant endeavor on the part of America to truly become a multiracial democracy. And that went in dramatic reverse when the troops were pulled out and when the essentially the military wing of Southern Democrats, also known as the Ku Klux Klan, came and intimidated Blacks to not vote, to not be integrated, to essentially be second and third class citizens. Well, there was one citizen that would not stand for it, and his name was Homer Plessy. And Plessy, that was told to move out of a car because he was Black and told to go into a second class steerage, even though he had paid for first class service, fought it. And his case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in an infamous, one of the most infamous decisions ever. I mean, and this is just 30 years after the Civil War, okay? The Supreme Court, by a vote of 8-1, Eric, I'll tell you how bad things were and how bad the environment was back then. By a vote of 8-1 said, you can have segregation. You can have separate but equal accommodations. And of course, those accommodations were never equal. But there was one dissenter in that case. And this is what a lot of people don't talk about very much. And I call him the spiritual grandfather of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And his I Have a Dream speech where he says, I want my children to be judged not on the color of their skin, but the content of their character. Well, there was a predecessor before Dr. King's brilliant statement. And that predecessor was John Marshall Harlan, Justice Harlan, a white boy from Kentucky, okay, that had been in favor of slavery, but evolved over time and came to truly embrace Black civil rights and Black equality, and actually ended up becoming best friends with Frederick Douglass. He dissented, and in that brilliant dissent, and I really urge your viewers to go on Google, get that dissent, and read it in its entirety. It is brilliant. And it would, of course, become the foundation upon which the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and a variety of other civil rights groups, including CORE, arguments we would borrow from Justice Harlan to push against the evil system of segregation. But in that decision, in that dissent, that famous dissent, he says, look, what's beautiful about it is that he was a white supremacist. He said, I believe the white race is a superior race. If you look at our deeds, you look at our accomplishments, and you look at what we have done in this country and around the world. And of course, at that time, globally, colonialism, European colonialism, where Africa and China and other parts of the world will be cut up like pizza pies, split up between Germany, France, England, etc. That is what was going on.
I need to fast forward you a little bit back to the 1942?
Yes, when CORE was established.
Right. Because we can spend all day talking about this, and we'll never get we'll never get to CORE. And I know you're
going back to bring you back up to date. So CORE, let's fast forward even further to 1954, because after the Supreme Court decision said the law of the land is going to be promoting desegregation, then CORE, which was often called the Marines of the Civil Rights Movement, decided to put that law to the test in the streets. And we would forcibly go into places like Woolworth, like we did in North Carolina, and sit, Black boys would sit at the counter to get a cup of coffee, which would be breaking against the custom and practices and even local laws, but really was quite legal vis-a-vis the Brown versus Board decision. We would also send groups of Black and white kids on buses throughout the South, sitting next to one another on buses, which of course was an absolute taboo below the Mason-Dixon line. Below the Mason-Dixon line, you had a white section of the bus, which was in the front, and you had the Black section of the bus that was in the back. Well, we of course said, no. We're going to put Black kids and white kids together, and dare you say that we're breaking a federal law when the federal law is on our side. And of course, that created a certain critical mass. And by the way, there was something else. If you fast forward even to 1964, dealing with voting rights, and again, real voter suppression, not the nonsense that the progressives talk about today, but real voter suppression. In 1964, we had two white boys from New York, Michael Sherner and Michael Goodman and Sherner, that along with James Chaney, a Black man from Mississippi, were part of a program called Freedom Summer, which CORE led, but there were other civil rights groups involved with that too, to register Blacks to vote in Mississippi, okay? Where the registration numbers for Blacks, it was like less than 2% of Blacks were even registered to vote, and probably even smaller percentage that actually voted. But we were registering folks to vote, and again, that military wing of the Southern Dixiecrats, Southern Democrats called the KKK, murdered those three boys. In fact, there's a famous picture, Eric, you've probably seen it, of Dr. King holding up the picture of those three boys that at that time were missing, but everybody knew that they had been murdered. And that galvanized the whole country behind the civil rights movement. It gave Lyndon Johnson even more muscle and juice, along with his Republican partner, Eric Dirksen, in the Senate, to get past the 1964 Civil Rights Act and eventually the Voting Rights Act in 1965, which would forever change our country.
So let me ask you this, then, to listen to Black Lives Matter and critical race theory and the 1619th Project, you think that our parents' civil rights movement failed, actually, that it didn't accomplish anything, because according to them, nothing has really changed. How do you look at that? How do you see that?
Well, I look at it in two ways. I look at it as an awful, horrific insult to the sacrifices of people like my father, people like your stepdad, your mom, okay, those that were warrior, people like Dr. King, our dear friend Alveda King's not only uncle, Dr. King, but her father, Dr. King, also were involved in the civil rights movement, and all those thousands of blacks and whites that came together to create a mostly peaceful revolution in our country. And it's a total insult. They really disrespect that movement and what was done. Now, that's my emotional reaction. My intellectual reaction to it is that critical race theory is a Marxist manifestation. Race is nothing more than a vehicle. The race and the promoting of the black aesthetic, or some would even say black supremacy, is an illusion. It is only a vehicle to move the country away from our constitutional based republic and democratic practices into a neo-Marxist socialist world. That is the agenda, that is the game, and that's what they're playing on, and they're doing typically what progressives have done historically, using black people, using the history of black Americans to promote an agenda and a game that has nothing to do with the interests of black folk.
How do you think your father or Dr. King, those of old, would view the quote civil rights movement that is happening today?
Well, I don't even have to speculate. All I have to do is look at quotes of what my father said before he passed away in 2016. And it wasn't anything that he said over the last couple of years. It's something that he said over the last 10, 15, 20 years, which is that the civil rights movement went away from becoming the morally based movement that could be open to all Americans until, and my father didn't mince words. He called it a racket. He called it a scheme.
Wow.
He said it was racial racketeering that takes place. And when you look at critical race theory and the way it's applied and the intimidation tactics that are used, it does look like racial racketeering. It does look like intimidation scheme. And what is so bad about it is that they do this in the name of black people, but it has nothing to do with black folk. Look at any socialist Marxist system around the world, and the people that pay the penalty and the price for living within that system are those on the lower socioeconomic rung of the ladder. For those, though, that would dare to want to climb out of poverty, that would want to join the middle class from the working class, socialism and those concepts guarantee to put a cap on any of your aspirations, on any of your hopes and dreams.
So you basically, I was about to ask you another question, but you basically answered. I was going to say, what do you think is the driving force behind the current movement about this whole culture, what we call culture wars? And I guess you basically said it's socialism, because the interesting thing is I found out that the issue is never really the issue. I mean, Black Lives Matter really isn't about Black lives. It's about.
And Eric, all you have to do, brother, is go to their website. They might have scrubbed it, but originally they had on their website, one of the platform items that I know is offensive to you as it is to me was the reversing of the nuclear family. Right. Ending the Western prescribed notions of nuclear family into some kind of strange and unusual, weird communal system that, again, has nothing to do with black folk. The Black Lives Matter was started, and I don't say this to disparage them. I say this because that's who they say they are. Was established by 3 lesbian neo-Marxists that are proud of taking pictures with people like Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan socialist dictator of Venezuela, that has his people killing zoo animals to feed themselves because that country is such a nightmare and a disaster.
Well, let me ask you this. As our last few seconds kind of tick away, is the only hope for the Black community or our nation to support conservative ideology?
No, I will not say to support conservative ideology or politicians, but I would say to support the values, and you can label them conservative or not, but I would say the Black values, many of which came out of the Black church, are promoted at Black dinner tables all across our country. The values that made us able to survive the most vicious type of real racism that existed at the end of Reconstruction and would exist into the 1950s and 1960s. It was those values, okay, of family, of promoting community, of wanting to do well in school, of working hard, of saying because you're Black and because of racism, you got to work twice as hard as your white counterpart. That has been totally inverted today to say that because of racism, you don't necessarily have to work so hard, because if you don't get the job, it's because of racism. If you didn't get the promotion, it's because of racism. Meanwhile, you've got not just whites, but you've got increasingly Asian Americans and even Hispanics surpassing us as a community. That is intolerable. We need to go back to the future and affirm those values that helped us to survive and to overcome.
Amen. Amen. I have to stop you there because we've run out of time. But man, there's so much more we could be talking about. I really appreciate your being here. I appreciate the work that our parents did and the legacy that they've left for you with your father, Roy Innis, and me, my mother, and my stepfather. I hope is that we continue to pass the torch on to the next generation. So thank you, Niger Innis, for being with us. For those who are watching, we'll be back in just a moment. Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Wallace, President and co-founder of Freedom's Journal Institute for the Study of Faith and Public Policy. And I'm here today to tell you about a project that we're really excited about. It's called Racism in America and the Role of the Church.
We live in a time and day of conspiracy, a threat to the poor, a threat to the have-nots.
We're doing this series because we believe that the Black church needs to hear another voice. There's a voice out there that is secular. Society as well as the media are pushing the narrative that there's a resurgence in racism in America, especially with the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter and other protest groups. It's tearing the church apart. And I believe it's time for the church in general, and the African American church in particular, to have another voice that has a different point of view, a biblical worldview. I'd ask you to prayerfully consider making a donation to this project. Thank you. Welcome back. In the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved, end quote. These are the words of Justice John Marshall Harlan in his dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Although this decision would legitimize, quote, separate but equal, end quote, for a time, it would eventually be overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. 10 years later, the 1964 Civil Rights Act would pass, then the 1965, the Voting Rights Act would pass. Other legislation against discrimination that started under President Eisenhower would eventually make it into law. So why would a group today like Black Lives Matter and Critical Race Theory and the 1619 Project proclaim that white people are racist by nature, that racism is systemic, and that blacks are constantly under oppression from the white man? I believe it's because they have a political and economic agenda. Booker T. Washington experienced something similar in 1911 when he stated, quote, "There is another class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Having learned that they are able to make a living out of their troubles, they have grown into the settled habit of advertising their wrongs, partly because they want sympathy and partly because it pays. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they don't want to lose their jobs," end quote. However, today's civil rights or social justice movement is more insidious. The movement today is not about black people or their lives. It's about political upheaval. Critical race theory comes out of critical theory, and it intends to make the United States a socialist country. To do so, they must change our culture by infiltrating our institutions. Antonio Gramsci, a Marxist philosopher, once stated, quote, "Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society," end quote. Today's civil rights or social justice movement is about cultural Marxism. The leaders of Black Lives Matter are professed Marxists. The teachings of critical race theory have Marxist underpinnings, and the 1619 Project is an attempt to rewrite history. The civil rights of the 20th century was an attempt to get the nation to live up to its founding documents, as Justice Harlan mentioned, and as Dr. Martin Luther King mentions in his I Have a Dream speech, when he said, "In a sense, we have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed to the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given its colored people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient fund," end quote. Today's movement seeks to overturn all the progress made by our forefathers, or act as if nothing ever happened. The social justice warriors want to create a new paradigm. They're not based on a Judeo-Christian free market society, but an anti-Christian pro-socialist ideology. The Apostle Paul warns us that we are in a spiritual battle. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5, quote, "For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being able to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete," end quote. Clearly, this reference is more about the teaching of the church in its context. Paul goes on to talk about strongholds, arguments, and opinions that are at odds with the knowledge of God. The Marxist rule or socialism is at odds with the kingdom of God. It is the doctrine or the teaching of demons mentioned in 1 Timothy 4:1. Thus, we need to reject it and apply the word of God to all calls for justice. But more on this text next time. Ladies and gentlemen, we are Kingdoms in Conflict.